I had always thought the most dangerous thing about Julian Vance was his ruthless, icy stare, but as the elevator suddenly groaned and plunged into total darkness, I realized the real threat was being trapped in a 6x6 metal box with the one man I was entirely forbidden to want. Hey everyone, if you're excited to see how this intense and romantic elevator ride unfolds, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what you think will happen next. Your support helps me create more stories like this. Now let's get into the story. Part 1. The Ice King's Cage. The rain was lashing violently against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 45th floor, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the reinforced glass. It was nearly 11 o'clock on a Friday night, and the sprawling, ultramodern headquarters of Vance Global Tech was completely deserted. Or at least it was supposed to be. I let out a long, exhausted sigh, rubbing my burning eyes as I finally saved the marketing presentation I had been agonizing over for the past 9 hours. My neck was stiff, my tie was loosened, and my usually neat brown hair was a disheveled mess from me constantly running my hands through it in frustration. I just wanted to go home, crawl into my unmade bed, and sleep for the next 3 days. As a junior executive coordinator, late nights were part of the job description, but tonight felt especially punishing. And it was all because of him. Julian Vance. Julian was the CEO and founder of the company. At 32 years old, he was a tech prodigy, a billionaire, and quite possibly the most terrifying man I had ever met in my life. People in the office called him the Ice King behind his back. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. A single, sharp look from his piercing gray eyes was enough to make grown men stutter and forget their own names. He was impossibly demanding, entirely unreadable, and completely detached from the social dynamics of the office. He was a machine wrapped in tailored Italian suits, operating on a level of perfection that left no room for human error. And, much to my own profound and daily humiliation, he was also the most devastatingly handsome man I had ever laid eyes on. Not that it mattered. To Julian, I was just another drone in the hive. In the year I had worked here, we had spoken exactly 5 times, and every single conversation had been strictly related to spreadsheets, quarterly reports, and scheduling conflicts. He was a man made of frost and steel, and I was just a 24-year-old guy trying to survive without getting fired. I packed up my laptop, slung my messenger bag over my shoulder, and began the long walk down the dimly lit corridor toward the executive elevators. The storm outside was intensifying, thunder rumbling so deep it vibrated through the soles of my shoes. I just needed to get to my car before the downtown streets completely flooded. I reached the elevator bank and pressed the down button. The polished chrome doors slid open immediately with a soft, expensive chime. I stepped inside the spacious, mahogany-paneled cabin, leaned back against the handrail, and pressed the button for the underground parking garage. The doors began to close. "Hold it." The voice was low, smooth, and possessed an authority that demanded absolute obedience. It cut through the quiet hum of the elevator like a blade. My heart practically leapt into my throat. I slammed my hand against the open door button on pure, panicked reflex. The heavy doors glided back apart, and there he was, Julian Vance. He stepped into the elevator, bringing with him the faint, intoxicating scent of cedarwood, rain, and expensive espresso. Despite the late hour, he looked impeccable. His charcoal suit didn't have a single wrinkle, his dark hair was perfectly styled, and his jawline looked sharp enough to cut glass. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other, his expression utterly blank. "Thank you," he said, his tone perfectly flat, not even glancing in my direction. "Of course, Mr. Vance," I replied, my voice sounding painfully squeaky in the confined space. I cleared my throat, trying to regain some shred of dignity, and pressed myself as flat against the back wall as humanly possible. The doors closed, sealing us in. The descent began. For the first 10 floors, the silence was so thick I felt like I was suffocating in it. I stared hard at the digital floor indicator above the doors, watching the red numbers tick down. 42, 41. 40. I didn't dare look at him, but I could feel his presence. It was like standing next to a dormant volcano. The sheer gravitational pull of the man was overwhelming. I forced myself to take slow, shallow breaths, praying he couldn't hear my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. "Just keep staring at the numbers, Liam," I told myself. 30 seconds, and you'll be in the garage. You can survive 30 seconds. 39, 38. And then, the universe decided it hated me. A deafening crack of thunder, shook the entire skyscraper. Before I could even register the sound, the building's power grid seemed to violently surge. The elevator gave a terrifying metallic shriek, jarring so hard that I was thrown completely off balance. My shoulders slammed into the wooden paneling as the elevator ground to a violent, stomach-churning halt. And then, the lights went out. Total, suffocating darkness. I gasped, my hands scrambling blindly against the wall to catch my balance. The sudden absence of light and the terrifying sound of the screeching brakes left my ears ringing. For a few agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence, save for the ragged sound of my own panicked breathing. "Mr. Vance." I managed to choke out, my voice trembling in the pitch black. There was a rustle of expensive fabric, and then a dim, sterile blue light flickered to life near the ceiling. The emergency backup power. It barely illuminated the space, casting long, eerie shadows across the cabin, but it was enough to see him. Julian hadn't fallen. He had caught himself on the brass handrail, standing just a few feet away from me. His phone was still in his hand, though the screen was completely dead. Slowly, smoothly, he placed the phone into his jacket pocket and turned to look at me. His face was a mask of perfect, infuriating calm. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice steady, as if asking about a quarterly projection rather than the fact that we were currently suspended hundreds of feet in the air in a broken metal box. "No," I breathed, rubbing my bruised shoulder. I don't think so. What just happened?" "A catastrophic power failure, likely caused by a lightning strike to the main grid," Julian said analytically. He moved toward the control panel, his movements fluid and unhurried. He pressed the emergency call button. Nothing happened. No dial tone, no operator voice, no static. He pressed it again, holding it down this time. Still nothing. "The backup generator hasn't engaged the main communication systems," Julian stated, taking a step back and observing the dark panel. "The line is completely dead." I felt a cold spike of panic pierce through my chest. "Dead? What do you mean dead? We can't be stuck. It's Friday night. There's no one left in the building. The security guards do their rounds on the ground floor." I lunged forward, pushing past him slightly to hit the buttons myself, slapping the open door button repeatedly as if brute force would suddenly fix a massive mechanical failure. "Come on, open up. Come on. Liam." The sound of my name on his lips made me freeze. It was the first time I had ever heard him say it. He didn't call me Mr. Hayes or associate. Just Liam. "Hitting the button repeatedly will not change the physical reality of our situation," Julian said, his tone laced with a mild, condescending patience. "The main suspension cables have locked as a failsafe. We are suspended between the 37th and 38th floors. We are not going anywhere." I pulled my hand back, my chest heaving. The reality of the situation was starting to crash down on me. The ventilation fan had stopped working when the power went out. The air in the small cabin was already starting to grow stale and noticeably warm. "So we just wait?" I asked, my voice rising an octave. "Until Monday morning? We'll suffocate by then." "We will not suffocate," Julian replied smoothly, leaning back against the wall and crossing his arms over his chest, looking completely unbothered. "Security protocol dictates a manual sweep of all elevator shafts in the event of a grid failure. They will find us. Eventually." "Eventually?" I echoed, running a frantic hand through my hair, pacing the small 3-step width of the elevator. My mild claustrophobia, which I usually kept well under control, was beginning to claw desperately at the edges of my mind. How long is eventually? An hour? 5 hours? What if they think the building is entirely empty and skip the upper floors? "Stop pacing," Julian commanded softly. "I can't stop pacing. I need to move. If I don't move, I'm going to lose my mind," I babbled, pulling at the collar of my shirt. It was definitely getting hot. The scent of Julian's cedarwood cologne was growing stronger in the stifling air, mixing with the metallic smell of the elevator tracks and my own nervous sweat. This is a nightmare. I have a cat. Who is going to feed my cat if I die in an elevator shaft? "You are not going to die, Liam. And your cat will be fine," Julian said, though I noticed a muscle in his sharp jaw twitch. "But you are burning through the limited oxygen in this space by hyperventilating. Sit down and be quiet." "I don't want to sit down," I snapped, the stress completely overriding my usual professional filter. "I want to get out of here. You're the billionaire CEO. Don't you have a direct line to the mayor or a private helicopter or something? Do something instead of just standing there acting like a robot." As soon as the words left my mouth, I instantly regretted them. The air in the elevator seemed to drop 10 degrees despite the growing, suffocating heat. Julian slowly uncrossed his arms. The movement was deliberate and incredibly predatory. He took a step toward me, then another. I instinctively backed up until my shoulder blades hit the cool metal wall. There was nowhere left to go. Julian stopped when he was less than a foot away. In the dim blue emergency light, his gray eyes looked almost black. The composed, distant CEO was suddenly gone, replaced by a man who looked dangerous, intense, and completely focused on me. I had to tilt my head up to maintain eye contact, my breath catching painfully in my throat. He reached up, and for one wild, irrational second, I thought he was going to wrap his hands around my neck. Instead, his long, elegant fingers gripped the knot of his own expensive silk tie. With a swift, fluid motion, he loosened it, pulling it down a few inches, before unbuttoning the top button of his crisp white shirt. The sight of his exposed collarbone made my brain short-circuit completely. Julian placed one hand flat on the wall right beside my head, effectively caging me in. The heat radiating off his large frame was palpable. I could feel the deep vibration of his voice in my own chest when he finally spoke. "If you do not stop panicking," Julian murmured, his voice dropping to a low, husky register that sent a violent shiver straight down my spine, "I am going to have to find a much more effective way to keep your mouth shut. Do you understand me, Liam?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare up into those dark, intense eyes, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, realizing with terrifying clarity that the ice-keeping Julian Vance composed was finally beginning to melt. End of Part 1. Part 2, the melting point. I stopped breathing. I actually forgot how to draw air into my lungs. Julian Vance was so close that I could feel the faint, rhythmic exhalation of his breath against my cheek. His eyes, usually a flat, impenetrable gray, were currently swirling with something dark and turbulent. My mind scrambled to process the reality of my billionaire boss, the man who usually didn't even acknowledge my existence in the boardroom, caging me against the elevator wall with a threat that sounded dangerously like a promise. I started, but my voice betrayed me, coming out as a pathetic, airy whisper. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to hold his gaze, even though every instinct screamed at me to look away. "I understand, Mr. Vance." Julian stared down at me for 3 agonizingly long seconds. His gaze flicked down to my lips for a fraction of a second, so fast I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, before moving back up to my eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his arm, stepping back and breaking the cage he had formed around me. The sudden absence of his body heat was startling. The cold metal of the wall pressed against my back as I finally remembered how to breathe, taking in a shaky, deep gulp of the stale air. "Good," Julian said, his voice returning to that smooth, emotionless cadence, though it still sounded a fraction deeper than usual. "Now, I suggest we make ourselves as comfortable as possible. This may take a while." He turned his back to me, taking off his suit jacket with an effortless grace. He folded it neatly and draped it over the brass handrail. The temperature in the elevator was undeniably rising, the lack of ventilation turning the small, enclosed space into a slow cooker. I watched, entirely mesmerized, as Julian undid the cufflinks of his crisp white shirt, rolling the sleeves up to his elbows, revealing strong, corded forearms dusted with dark hair. He was meticulously shedding the armor of his CEO persona, piece by piece, right in front of me. It felt too intimate, too private for a junior coordinator to witness. Realizing I was staring, I quickly fumbled with my own jacket, shrugging it off and tossing it unceremoniously onto my briefcase on the floor. I tugged my tie entirely loose and shoved it into my pocket, unbuttoning the top 2 buttons of my shirt in a desperate bid to cool down. Julian sat down on the floor, resting his back against the mahogany paneling, stretching his long legs out in front of him. He looked up at me, one perfectly sculpted eyebrow raised. "Are you planning to stand at attention for the next few hours, Liam, or are you going to sit down?" I hesitated, then slid down the wall opposite him, putting as much distance between us as the tiny 6x6 cabin would allow. My knees were drawn up, my arms resting on them. The dim blue emergency light cast shadows across his face, making his cheekbones look sharper, his expression even more unreadable. 10 minutes passed in excruciating silence. The only sounds were the faint hum of the backup generator somewhere above us and the steady rhythm of our breathing. The heat was becoming oppressive. I could feel a bead of sweat roll down the back of my neck. "You know," I finally said, unable to bear the heavy silence any longer. My voice sounded loud in the confined space. "You don't have to pretend." Julian's head tilted slightly. "Pretend what?" "Pretend that this doesn't bother you. Pretend that you aren't human like the rest of us," I challenged, the heat and the exhaustion stripping away my professional filter. I had nothing to lose at this point. I was already trapped. You sit there like a statue. The building gets struck by lightning, we get trapped in a metal box, and you just shut down. Do you ever actually feel anything? Julian's eyes narrowed. The air between us seemed to crackle. "I assure you, Liam, I feel quite a lot. I simply possess the discipline not to let my emotions dictate my actions. A trait you might do well to learn." "Discipline," I scoffed, running a hand through my messy brown hair. "Is that what you call it? Because everyone else calls it being an ice block. You walk through the office like we're all invisible. You've been my boss for a year, and I bet you don't even know what department I work in." A heavy, loaded silence hung in the air. Julian didn't look away. Instead, a slow, dangerous smirk touched the corner of his lips. "You are a junior executive coordinator in the marketing department," Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "You were hired exactly 1 year and 3 weeks ago. You prefer to work late on Fridays because you hate the rush hour traffic on the subway. You drink your coffee black, but you add 3 packets of sugar when you're stressed. You have a habit of biting the end of your pen during board meetings, and when you present a marketing deck, you shift your weight to your left foot every time you lie about projected numbers." I sat there, utterly paralyzed. My mouth was slightly open, my brain struggling to process what I had just heard. He knew. He knew all of it. The man who supposedly didn't notice anyone had practically memorized my entire existence. "How?" I whispered, my heart hammering a frantic, wild beat against my ribs. "How do you know all of that? You've never looked at me twice." Julian let out a low, humorless laugh, tilting his head back against the wall. He closed his eyes for a moment, and for the first time, he looked genuinely tired. When he opened them again, the intensity in his gaze pinned me to the floor. "You have absolutely no idea, do you?" Julian murmured softly. "You think I ignore you because I don't care. You think I am cold because I feel nothing." He leaned forward, uncrossing his legs, moving slightly closer to the center of the elevator. My breath hitched in my throat as his imposing figure filled my vision. "I ignore you, Liam, because if I allow myself to look at you for more than 5 seconds, I will lose every ounce of that discipline you seem to despise so much," Julian stated, his voice laced with a raw, restrained frustration. "Do you have any idea how distracting you are? How maddening it is to sit at the head of a conference table and watch you chew on that damn pen, knowing I cannot walk over there, pull it out of your mouth, and show you exactly what it means to be my employee." A violent shiver ran through my entire body despite the sweltering heat of the elevator. The words hung in the air, heavy and charged with an undeniable, electric tension. My mind raced. The CEO. The Ice King. He had been watching me. He had been fighting this, whatever this was, just as much as I had been unknowingly craving his attention. You're lying," I breathed out, my voice trembling. "You're just saying that to mess with my head." "I never lie," Julian countered, his gray eyes flashing fiercely. "And I never waste my time playing games." I swallowed hard. The air in the elevator felt impossibly thin. I was suffocating, but it had nothing to do with the lack of oxygen and everything to do with the man sitting across from me. I wanted to look away, to hide behind my usual professional subservience, but the raw honesty in his eyes made it impossible. "Then why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why keep up the act? Why act like I'm nothing to you?" Julian's jaw tightened. "Because I am the CEO of this company, and you are my subordinate. There are rules, boundaries, lines that cannot be crossed without risking everything I have built, and more importantly, risking your career. If people knew, if the board suspected." He cut himself off, running a hand over his face. "It is easier to be cold. It is safer to be the Ice King. Safe is boring." I blurted out before I could stop myself. Julian's eyes snapped to mine, a dark, hungry fire igniting in their depths. "Do not provoke me, Liam. Not when we are trapped in here. My restraint is currently hanging by a very frayed thread." "I'm not provoking you," I lied, my pulse racing as a strange, reckless surge of bravery flooded my veins. I leaned forward, mirroring his posture, closing the physical distance between us until our knees were mere inches apart. "I'm just saying, You're not the only one who has been holding back. Julian's breath hitched. For a second, the impeccable facade shattered completely. His gaze dropped to my lips, and this time, he didn't look away. I could see the internal war waging behind his eyes. The battle between his ironclad control and the sheer, overwhelming desire trapped in this 6x6 box. He reached out, his large hand trembling slightly before his fingers brushed against my knee. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. "Liam," he warned, his voice a gravelly whisper. "If you do not move back right now, I am not going to be responsible for what happens next." I didn't move. I couldn't. I was caught in his gravity, completely mesmerized by the intense, raw vulnerability radiating from him. "Then don't be responsible," I whispered back. The space between us practically caught fire. Julian's eyes went completely dark, his hand sliding up my thigh, gripping the fabric of my trousers tightly. He leaned in, the scent of cedarwood and heat enveloping me entirely. My eyes fluttered shut, my body leaning into him, anticipating the crash of his lips against mine. And then, with a deafening metallic screech, the elevator violently lurched. The sudden, aggressive drop threw us both off balance. I pitched forward, crying out as gravity vanished for a split second. Strong arms wrapped around me instantly, absorbing the impact as we crashed onto the hard wooden floor together. The emergency brakes engaged with a brutal, teeth-rattling groan, throwing us into a heap in the center of the cabin. I gasped, my eyes flying open. I was sprawled directly on top of Julian. My hands were planted flat against his broad chest, feeling the frantic, hammering rhythm of his heart beneath the thin cotton of his shirt. His arms were wrapped tightly around my waist, holding me flush against his hard, muscular body. The world had stopped spinning, but the air between us was crackling with a terrifying, undeniable electricity. We were completely entangled in the dim blue light, alone, trapped, and exactly where we weren't supposed to be. Julian stared up at me, his chest heaving, his hands gripping my hips with a possessive, bruised force. The Ice King was gone, and in his place was a man who looked like he was starving, and I was the only thing on the menu. "Julian," I breathed, using his first name for the very first time. His eyes darkened, pulling me impossibly closer. End of Part 2. Part 3, Shattering the Ice. The moment his name slipped past my lips, the final, fraying thread of Julian Vance's legendary control completely snapped. He didn't speak. He didn't issue a command, a warning, or a corporate directive. He simply surged upward, his large hands sliding aggressively from my hips to tangle deep into the hair at the nape of my neck. With a raw, breathless groan that vibrated against my chest, he pulled my mouth down to his. The collision of our lips was nothing short of a violent explosion. I gasped into his mouth, the sudden, searing heat of him entirely overwhelming my senses. There was nothing gentle or hesitant about the kiss. It was messy, frantic, and driven by a year's worth of suppressed, maddening tension. It was the kiss of a starving man who had finally been handed a feast, and I was entirely consumed by it. My hands, previously flat against his chest, moved on pure, unadulterated instinct. I gripped the broad, muscular expanse of his shoulders, my fingers digging into the crisp fabric of his expensive shirt as I kissed him back with just as much desperation. Julian shifted beneath me, rolling us over with an effortless, predatory grace until my back hit the cool wooden floor of the elevator. He hovered over me, caging me between his massive frame and the floorboards. His mouth never left mine. His lips were demanding, incredibly skilled, and completely intoxicating. He tasted like dark espresso and pure, unfiltered power. Every time I tried to catch my breath, he deepened the kiss, his tongue sliding against mine, leaving me dizzy and utterly disoriented. His thumb traced the sharp line of my jaw, his grip firm and possessive, completely obliterating any lingering illusion of the distant, unfeeling CEO I thought I knew. This was Julian, unfiltered, unrestrained, and terrifyingly real. When we finally broke apart, it was only because the absolute necessity for oxygen outweighed the magnetic pull between us. My chest heaved, my lips swollen and tingling, my lungs burning as I stared up at the man hovering over me. Julian's eyes were wild, completely blown out and dark, save for the thin rim of storm gray around his irises. His chest rose and fell in ragged, heavy pants, his hair, always styled to absolute perfection, now a messy, tousled halo around his face where my fingers had ruined it. We stayed like that for a long, heavy moment. The only sounds in the suffocatingly hot cabin were our synchronized, breathless gasps and the faint, mechanical hum of the dying backup generator. "You," Julian rasped, his voice dropping an entire octave, sending a fresh wave of shivers violently cascading down my spine. "You are going to be the absolute ruin of me, Liam." I swallowed hard, trying to ground myself in reality, but my mind was still spinning from the sheer intensity of what had just happened. "If this is what ruin looks like, I don't think I mind." A low, vibrating chuckle rumbled deep within Julian's chest, a sound so rare, so incredibly foreign to the Ice King persona that it made my heart physically ache. He rested his forehead against mine, closing his eyes as he fought to steady his breathing. The heat radiating off his body was immense, only adding to the sweltering temperature of the broken elevator. "I have spent 382 days pretending you are just a coordinator," Julian murmured against my skin, the confession tearing through the silence like a confession in a dark cathedral. 382 days of walking past your desk, making sure I look straight ahead, because if I look at you for even a second, I want to drag you into my office and lock the door. My breath hitched. He had counted the days. The billionaire CEO, the man who handled multi-million-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat, had been counting the exact number of days since I started working at Vance Global Tech. "Julian," I whispered, lifting a trembling hand to brush a stray lock of dark hair away from his forehead. The intimacy of the gesture felt heavy, dangerous, but I couldn't stop myself. His eyes fluttered open, locking onto mine with a vulnerability that completely shattered his impenetrable armor. "Do you know how infuriating it is? To sit in board meetings, listening to financial projections, while the only thing I can think about is the way you smile when you think no one is watching, or the way your brow furrows when you're frustrated by a spreadsheet. I thought you hated me," I admitted, my voice small, the confession slipping out before I could censor it. "You were always so sharp, so incredibly cold. Every time I handed you a report, you wouldn't even look me in the eye." Julian shifted his weight, moving so he was lying beside me on the hard floor, though he kept one heavy arm draped securely across my waist, pinning me to his side. The dim blue emergency light painted shadows across his face as he stared up at the ceiling of the elevator. "I had to be," he said quietly. "You are young, Liam. You are brilliant, driven, and your career is just starting. I am the CEO. I am the man who holds the keys to your livelihood. The power dynamic between us is a minefield. If I had shown even a fraction of what I felt, they would say I was exploiting you. They would say you only got your promotions because you were sleeping with the boss. I refused to let my lack of self-control tarnish your reputation." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He hadn't been ignoring me out of arrogance or indifference. He had been doing it to protect me. He had weaponized his coldness to keep me safe from the vicious, unforgiving gossip of corporate culture. My heart swelled with a fierce, unexpected ache. I turned onto my side, propping myself up on my elbow so I could look down at him. The heat in the cabin was becoming truly unbearable. My dress shirt was sticking to my back, and a sheen of sweat coated Julian's exposed collarbones. "You don't get to make those decisions for me," I said firmly, my voice stronger now, laced with a newfound confidence. "I am an adult, Julian. I know what the risks are. I know the corporate rules. But I also know that I have spent the last year entirely terrified of you, while simultaneously praying you would look at me." Julian turned his head, his gaze intensely locked onto mine. "Are you saying you want this? Even knowing the complications?" "I'm saying," I began, slowly trailing my fingertips down the center of his chest, feeling him shudder at the light touch, "that we are currently trapped hundreds of feet in the air, in a metal box that is rapidly turning into an oven. The outside world doesn't exist right now. The company, the board, the rumors, none of it matters in here. For tonight, it's just us." Julian's jaw clenched, his eyes tracking the movement of my fingers against his shirt. The fragile restraint he had been trying to rebuild over the last 5 minutes shattered into a million irreparable pieces. With a swift, decisive motion, he sat up, pulling me with him until I was straddling his lap. The sudden shift in position sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to my core. My legs bracketed his hips, and before I could even process the movement, his hands were on the buttons of my dress shirt. "You're right," Julian commanded, his voice dark, ragged, and utterly authoritative. "It is entirely too hot in here." My breath caught as his deft fingers made quick work of my buttons. Within seconds, my ruined shirt was pushed off my shoulders, pooling at my elbows. The cool air of the cabin brushed against my heated skin, But it was nothing compared to the blazing heat of Julian's palms as they finally made direct contact with my bare waist. I shivered violently, a soft gasp escaping my lips as his thumbs traced the faint outline of my ribs. He looked at me, truly looked at me, with a gaze so possessive and filled with raw desire that I felt entirely exposed, completely defenseless against the sheer force of his presence. "Beautiful," he breathed, the words slipping past his lips like a prayer. I didn't hesitate. I reached for the remaining buttons on his crisp white shirt, my hands shaking slightly. Julian didn't stop me. He watched me with those intense, stormy eyes as I parted the fabric, pushing it back to reveal the hard, sculpted expanse of his chest. He was flawless. Every inch of him looked like it had been carved from marble, and yet he felt so incredibly warm, so human beneath my touch. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against his, our chests brushing together. The friction of our skin was maddening. I could feel his heartbeat hammering wildly against mine, a frantic, syncopated rhythm that echoed the absolute chaos in my own chest. "If we get out of here," Julian whispered, his hands sliding up my spine, sending sparks flying across every nerve ending. "I am not putting the walls back up, Liam. I can't. Not after this. Not after tasting you." "Then don't," I replied, tilting my head, capturing his lips in another desperate, bruising kiss. This time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. We devoured each other in the dim blue light of our metal cage, the suffocating heat and the terrifying reality of our situation entirely forgotten. There was only the taste of him, the intoxicating scent of cedarwood, and the overwhelming realization that the Ice King had finally melted, and I was the one holding the fire. Suddenly, a loud, metallic screech echoed from the shaft above us, violently interrupting the quiet hum of the cabin. The elevator jerked slightly, swaying on its locked cables, a terrifying reminder that our private haven was still a broken, dangerous trap suspended in the sky. Julian's arms tightened around me like a vice, his protective instincts instantly flaring as he shielded my body with his own, looking up at the dark ceiling. The real world was coming for us, but as I buried my face in his neck, breathing him in, I knew that no matter what happened when those doors finally opened, nothing would ever be the same again. End of Part 3. Part 4. The Reality of the Light. The violent jerk of the elevator cabin was accompanied by a horrifying, metallic screech that sounded like the building itself was tearing apart. The sudden movement threw us, and for a terrifying, weightless fraction of a second, I thought the fail-safes had completely given out. I thought we were going to plunge 37 stories down into the concrete foundation of the Vance Global Tech Tower. But we didn't fall. The emergency brakes caught with a brutal, teeth-rattling shudder that vibrated through the wooden floorboards and straight into my bones. Before I could even process the scream that had lodged itself in my throat, Julian's arms were wrapped around me like bands of forged steel. He had twisted his body with lightning speed, taking the brunt of the impact against the mahogany paneling and completely shielding my body with his own. His large hand cradled the back of my head, pressing my face into the crook of his neck as the cables above us groaned in agonizing protest. We stayed frozen like that, a tangled mess of limbs and racing heartbeats, waiting for the floor to drop out from beneath us. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. The only sound left in the suffocating darkness was the ragged, desperate sound of our own breathing. "Julian," I gasped, my voice muffled against his skin. My hands were gripping his bare shoulders so tightly that my knuckles were entirely white. "Julian, the cables." "Shoo, I've got you," Julian murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble against my chest. Despite the absolute chaos of the moment, his tone was an anchor of pure authority and calm. "I have you, Liam. We are secure. The secondary locking mechanisms, just engaged. We aren't going anywhere." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force my violently trembling body to believe him. The intoxicating, heavy heat of the moments before had been instantly replaced by the icy, paralyzing grip of raw fear. But as Julian's hand slowly began to stroke up and down my spine, a gentle, rhythmic motion that felt entirely at odds with the terrifying situation, my panic slowly began to recede. I pulled back slightly, just enough to look at him in the dim, fading blue light of the emergency backup generator. His chest was heaving, covered in a sheen of sweat, his dark hair falling messy and entirely unstyled across his forehead. He looked wild, untamed, and so incredibly beautiful that it physically ached to look at him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his gray eyes scanning every inch of my face with a frantic, scanning intensity. His large hands moved down my arms, checking for injuries, his touch urgent and incredibly possessive. "No," I breathed out, my voice shaky. "I'm okay. You shielded me. Did you hit the wall hard?" "I am fine," Julian stated firmly, his thumbs coming up to brush the hair away from my sweat-dampened forehead. "As long as you are safe, I am perfectly fine." The sincerity in his voice, stripped of all corporate artifice and coldness, sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing over me. This was the CEO of one of the most powerful tech conglomerates in the world. A man who commanded thousands of employees, who sat across from ruthless investors and never blinked. And yet, here he was, sitting on the floor of a broken elevator, entirely focused on making sure a junior marketing coordinator was unhurt. But as the adrenaline slowly began to drain from my system, the harsh, unforgiving reality of our situation began to set in. The backup battery for the emergency lights gave one final, pathetic flicker before completely dying out. We were plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. I let out a small, involuntary gasp, my hands immediately reaching out to find him. Julian caught my wrists instantly, pulling my hands flat against his bare chest so I could feel the steady, reassuring thrum of his heartbeat. "I am right here," Julian whispered in the dark. "I am not letting go." The darkness was entirely absolute. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The temperature in the cabin had reached a sweltering, unbearable peak. The air was incredibly stale, thick with the scent of hot metal, dust, and Julian's sharp cedarwood cologne. We were sitting half-dressed on the floor, the remnants of our ruined shirts pooled somewhere in the darkness around us. "They're going to find us eventually," I whispered, the reality of the outside world suddenly crashing down on me like a physical weight. "The power grid, the maintenance crews. Someone is going to pry those doors open, Julian. And when they do..." I trailed off, the words too heavy to speak into the dark. Julian shifted closer, pulling my legs over his lap, so I was entirely bracketed by his body. In the sensory deprivation of the darkness, his touch was everything. I could feel the heat radiating off his skin, the flex of his muscles as he held me. "When they do," Julian finished for me, his voice dangerously quiet, "they will find the CEO and his employee trapped in an elevator. That is all." My heart sank, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. "So, we just put our clothes back on, step out into the hallway, and pretend none of this happened? We go back to you ignoring me in the break room and me being terrified to speak to you. Liam." The way he said my name was a reprimand, laced with a heavy, raw ache. His large hands moved from my wrists to cup my face in the dark, his thumbs tracing the line of my cheekbones. "Listen to me very carefully. I told you I am not putting the walls back up. I meant it, but we cannot allow the world to see this. Not yet." I swallowed hard, leaning into the warmth of his palms. "Because of the board. Because of the vultures," Julian corrected bitterly. "Vance Global Tech was built by my father, but the board of directors has been waiting for me to make a single, fatal mistake since the day I took over. They want blood, Liam. They want a scandal. If they find out I am involved with a junior employee, someone under my direct supervision, they won't just fire me. They will absolutely destroy your career in the process. They will drag your name through the corporate mud, paint you as a climber, and make sure you never work in this industry again." The absolute certainty in his voice made me shiver. He wasn't being dramatic. He was stating a factual reality. The corporate world was entirely ruthless, and the higher up you were, the sharper the knives became. "I don't care about them," I whispered fiercely, my hands finding his waist in the dark, gripping him tightly. "I care about this. I care about the fact that for the past year, I've felt completely invisible, and tonight, you actually looked at me." Julian let out a ragged breath, leaning forward until his forehead rested against mine. "I have always looked at you, Liam. Even when you thought I was looking through you, you were the only thing in the room I actually saw. But I will not let my selfishness ruin your life." "It's my life to ruin," I argued stubbornly. "Not while I am responsible for you," Julian countered, his voice returning to that commanding, authoritative tone, though it was infinitely softer than he used in the boardroom. "When those doors open, we must be impeccable. You will let me handle the security team. You will let me handle the paramedics. And on Monday morning, you will walk into that office and do your job as if nothing has changed." "And what happens after Monday morning?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. I hated the idea of going backward. I hated the idea of losing this incredible, raw connection we had just forged in the dark. Julian's lips brushed against my forehead in the dark, a tender, grounding kiss that sent a wave of heat straight to my toes. "After Monday morning," Julian whispered, his lips moving down to lightly graze the shell of my ear, "I am going to figure out exactly how to systematically dismantle every single corporate policy that stands between me and you. I am going to restructure this company if I have to. But until I do, you have to trust me. Can you do that?" I closed my eyes, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the man holding me. He wasn't just offering me a secret romance. He was promising to change his entire world to make room for me in it. "I trust you," I breathed. "Good," Julian murmured. Before he could say anything else, a sudden, loud clanking sound echoed from directly above us. We both froze. Heavy footsteps reverberated through the metal roof of the elevator cabin, followed by the distinct sound of a massive, heavy wrench hitting steel. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" A gruff, muffled voice shouted through the ventilation grate. "We've got the main shaft secured. Stand back from the doors." The rescue team. They were here. The private, intimate bubble we had created in the dark was about to violently burst. "Get dressed," Julian ordered instantly, the CEO persona snapping back into place with terrifying speed. He released me, shifting away in the dark. I could hear the rustle of fabric as he frantically searched for his shirt on the floor. Panic seized me as I scrambled in the absolute darkness, my hands blindly patting the wooden floorboards. I can't find my shirt, Julian. I can't see anything." "Here." Julian's voice came from my left. I felt the crisp cotton of my dress shirt being shoved into my hands. "Put it on. Quickly. Do not bother with the tie." My hands were shaking violently as I shoved my arms into the sleeves, my fingers fumbling uselessly with the small buttons. The heat, the adrenaline, and the sheer panic of being caught in such a compromising position made my fine motor skills completely evaporate. I managed to get 3 buttons done just as a massive crowbar was jammed into the center seam of the elevator doors. "Liam, calm down," Julian commanded quietly. I felt his large, steady hands brush mine away in the dark, his fingers swiftly and expertly doing up the remaining buttons on my shirt, right up to my collarbone. He smoothed the fabric down over my chest, his touch lingering for just a fraction of a second before he pulled away. "Breathe. You are perfectly fine." With a deafening, agonizing groan of protesting metal, the elevator doors were brutally pried apart by 2 massive firefighters. The sudden influx of blinding, brilliant light was absolute agony. I threw my arm over my eyes, shrinking back against the wall as the beams of 3 high-powered flashlights completely flooded the small cabin. "We've got 2 individuals in here," one of the firefighters yelled over his shoulder, shining the light directly at us. "Sir, are you both unharmed?" I blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the harsh light. When my vision finally cleared, the sight before me was entirely surreal. Julian was standing in front of me, effectively shielding me from the direct glare of the flashlights and the prying eyes of the rescue crew in the hallway. His shirt was buttoned impeccably, though wrinkled, and his posture was entirely rigid, commanding, and absolutely flawless. He looked exactly like the Ice King again. "We are uninjured," Julian stated, his voice a flat, booming baritone that instantly commanded the respect of every person in the hallway. "However, the temperature in this cabin has exceeded safe limits. My associate is experiencing symptoms of heat exhaustion. I expect paramedics on standby immediately." "Yes, Mr. Vance." "Right away, sir." A panic-building security guard stammered from behind the firefighters, clearly terrified that the billionaire CEO had been trapped in his building. Julian turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the sharp profile of his jawline. He didn't look at me directly, but his broad shoulders shifted, creating a perfect, protective barrier as the firefighters extended a hand to help us step up out of the sunken cabin and onto the 37th floor. "Stay close to me," Julian murmured, his voice so low only I could hear it over the chaos of the rescue workers. I took a deep, shaky breath, buttoning my cuffs and trying to smooth down my messy hair. The real world had finally broken in, harsh, bright, and completely unforgiving. But as I stepped out of the metal box and into the chaotic, brightly lit hallway, following the imposing, broad back of Julian Vance, I realized that I wasn't terrified of him anymore. The Ice King might be back for the rest of the world, but I knew exactly how hot the fire burned beneath the surface. And he was burning it all for me. End of Part 4. Part 5, The Monday Facade. The flashing red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles painted the glass walls of the Vance Global Tech lobby in harsh, chaotic strokes. The moment my feet hit the polished marble of the ground floor, I was swarmed. Paramedics descended upon me with blood pressure cuffs and oxygen masks, wrapping a foil thermal blanket around my shoulders despite my repeated, exhausted protests that I was perfectly fine. I sat on the edge of an ambulance bumper, the cool night air feeling like absolute heaven against my sweat-dampened skin, though my mind was completely detached from the medical personnel hovering over me. My eyes were frantically scanning the chaotic lobby for him. Julian was standing 20 feet away, completely surrounded by building managers, the chief of security, and the captain of the fire department. If anyone else had just spent 3 hours trapped in a sweltering, unventilated metal box, they would look disheveled. Julian Vance simply looked inconvenienced. His suit jacket was draped effortlessly over his arm, his shirt buttoned flawlessly to the collar. His posture was imposing, his expression a mask of absolute, impenetrable frost. He was barking rapid-fire questions about structural integrity and fail-safe protocols, his voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the noise of the lobby like a finely honed blade. He was the Ice King once again, the billionaire CEO demanding answers. Looking at him, it was entirely impossible to believe that less than 30 minutes ago, that same man had been lying on the floor of a broken elevator, his hands tangled in my hair, kissing me like his life depended on it. As if sensing my gaze, Julian's eyes flicked over the heads of the security team, locking onto mine across the crowded room. For a fraction of a second, the icy facade slipped. The sharp lines of his face softened, and a profound, possessive heat flared in his gray eyes. It was a silent, loaded promise. I haven't forgotten. Trust me. Then just as quickly, the mask slammed back into place. Julian turned his attention back to the fire captain, dismissing me entirely. Make sure Mr. Hayes is evaluated thoroughly and provided a company car to take him home. I heard Julian order his head of security, his tone completely devoid of any personal affection. I expect a full diagnostic report on my desk by Monday morning. And with that, he turned on his heel and walked out the heavy glass doors into the stormy night, slipping into the back of a sleek, waiting town car. I was left sitting on the ambulance bumper, shivering slightly under the foil blanket, my lips still tingling from the phantom weight of his kiss. The weekend was absolute, unadulterated torture. I spent Saturday entirely restless, pacing the small footprint of my apartment while my orange tabby cat, Barnaby, watched me with distinct feline judgment. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would slam against my ribs in a frantic, desperate rhythm, only for me to look at the screen and see a promotional email or a text from my mother. Julian didn't call. He didn't text. Logically, I knew he wouldn't. He didn't have my personal cell phone number, and even if he did, reaching out to me outside of corporate channels was exactly the kind of reckless behavior he had sworn to avoid. He was protecting me. He was playing the long game. But emotionally, the silence was deafening. By Sunday night, a toxic, insidious seed of doubt had begun to take root in the back of my mind. What if the heat and the adrenaline had just gotten to him? What if, in the cold, rational light of day, he realized that getting involved with a 24-year-old junior marketing coordinator was a colossal mistake? What if I walked into the office on Monday and he looked right through me again? I barely slept. When my alarm finally blared at 6:30 on Monday morning, I felt like I was walking to my own execution. I chose my clothes with an agonizing level of care. A tailored navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a subtle silver tie. I wanted to look professional, composed, and absolutely untouched by the chaotic events of Friday night. The moment I stepped off the standard employee elevator onto the marketing floor, the whispering began. Corporate gossip moves faster than the speed of light. Before I had even set my briefcase down at my cubicle, I was intercepted by Sarah, a senior copywriter whose desk was adjacent to mine. "Liam, oh my God, are you okay?" she gasped, clutching her oversized coffee mug like a lifeline. "The entire building is talking about it. You were stuck in the executive elevator with him." "I'm fine, Sarah, really." I forced a polite, exhausted smile, booting up my computer. "It was just a power grid failure. We were only in there for a few hours." "Only a few hours?" With Julian Vance. Dave, our department's data analyst, popped his head over the cubicle partition, his eyes wide with morbid curiosity. "Dude, I would have thrown myself down the elevator shaft." "Did he yell at you? Did he fire you?" "I heard he fired a guy in accounting last week, just for using the wrong font on a balance sheet. My stomach twisted violently, a sudden, fierce protectiveness flaring up in my chest. They didn't know him. They didn't know the man who had shielded my body with his own when the elevator dropped. They only knew the monster he pretended to be to keep the board of directors at bay. No, he didn't yell. I lied smoothly, arranging my pens with forced casualness. He was actually perfectly professional. He just sat on the floor and worked on his phone the whole time. We barely spoke. Wow. The Ice King strikes again, Sarah shivered dramatically. Well, I'm just glad you survived the freezing temperatures, Liam. The marketing presentation is at 11, and Anderson is already having a meltdown. We need you. The presentation. My blood ran completely cold. I had entirely forgotten that today was the end-of-quarter review. The marketing department was scheduled to present our Q3 projections to the executive board, which meant, in exactly 2 hours, I was going to have to stand in a boardroom and look Julian Vance directly in the eye in front of 20 of the most powerful people in the company. The next 2 hours blurred into a frantic haze of printing decks, organizing spreadsheets, and trying to ignore the violent, nauseating flip of my stomach. When 11 o'clock finally arrived, I followed my department head, Mr. Anderson, into the massive, glass-walled executive boardroom on the 45th floor. The room was intimidatingly silent. The long, polished mahogany table was flanked by the board of directors, older, wealthy men and women in immaculate suits who looked like they enjoyed destroying careers for sport. And sitting at the absolute head of the table, radiating an aura of sheer, unfiltered power, was Julian. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that looked sharper than a knife. His hands were steeped in front of him, his posture impossibly rigid. As Anderson and I took our places at the presentation screen, Julian's cold, gray eyes slowly swept the room before landing directly on me. There was no warmth, no recognition, nothing. It was like staring at a stranger. The impact of his absolute indifference hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My breath hitched, my hands suddenly trembling so badly I had to grip the edges of the podium just to keep them steady. He regrets it, my panicked mind screamed. He put the walls back up. You may begin, Mr. Anderson, Julian commanded, his voice a flat, booming baritone that echoed off the glass walls. And please skip the pleasantries. I am only interested in the raw data. Anderson, a man 20 years Julian's senior, visibly sweated. He launched into the presentation, his voice wavering slightly as he clicked through the slides. I stood slightly behind him, my job essentially relegated to passing out the physical portfolios and managing the digital transitions on the screen. 10 minutes in, Anderson made a mistake. He fumbled a crucial statistic regarding our projected digital outreach in the Asian markets. It was a minor error, a simple misreading of a graph, but in this room, blood was in the water. Excuse me, one of the board members, a viciously sharp woman named Eleanor, interrupted coldly. Those numbers do not align with the overhead costs you projected on slide 4. Are you inflating the outreach to cover the deficit, Anderson? Anderson froze, his face draining of color. No ma'am, I believe the algorithm, just the data. The silence in the room became thick, suffocating, and incredibly dangerous. Julian leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing into predatory slits. He was going to decimate Anderson, and by extension, our entire department. Before I could stop myself, before the rational, terrified part of my brain could tell me to stay quiet and invisible, I stepped up to the microphone. If I may clarify, Ms. Eleanor, I projected my voice, forcing it to remain steady despite the absolute panic raging in my veins. Every single head in the room snapped toward me. The junior coordinator, the lowest person on the corporate ladder in the room. I had just interrupted a board member. I forced myself not to look at Julian. I looked directly at Eleanor. The data on slide 4 represents physical logistics, not digital outreach, I explained, pulling up a secondary spreadsheet on the screen with a swift click of the remote. If you cross-reference the algorithms with the localized beta testing we ran last month, you will see a 30% increase in engagement, which completely neutralizes the deficit. Mr. Anderson was quoting the gross margin, not the net. The numbers are entirely sound. The room fell dead silent. Eleanor stared at the screen, her lips pursed tightly, unable to find a flaw in the math. I slowly turned my head, my heart hammering a frantic, wild rhythm against my ribs, and finally looked at the head of the table. Julian was staring at me. The icy, impenetrable mask was still firmly in place, but his gray eyes were completely dark. The exact same shade of dark they had been in the sweltering heat of the elevator when he had backed me against the wall. The silence stretched on for 5 agonizing seconds. "Acceptable, Mr. Hayes," Julian said smoothly, his voice devoid of any inflection, though I swore I saw the faintest, imperceptible twitch at the corner of his sharp jaw. "Your grasp on the data is adequate. Let us move on to the Q4 projections." I stepped back, my legs feeling entirely like jelly, the adrenaline crash hitting me so hard I felt dizzy. I had survived. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. When it was finally over, the board members filed out, leaving Anderson to profusely, breathlessly thank me for saving his job. I kept my eyes pinned to the floor, packing up the laptops, entirely terrified to look back at the head of the table. When I finally dared to glance up, Julian's chair was empty. He was gone. I returned to my desk on the marketing floor feeling completely hollowed out. The doubt had solidified into a heavy, aching certainty. The elevator had been a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment that Julian was now aggressively correcting by ignoring my existence. I slumped into my office chair, resting my forehead against my palms, trying to fight the humiliating sting of tears threatening the back of my eyes. A sharp ping from my computer shattered the quiet of my cubicle. I blinked, sitting up and opening my email inbox. It was a message marked with the highest level of corporate urgency. My heart stopped completely as I read the sender's name. Victoria Vance, Senior Executive Assistant to the CEO. I clicked the email with trembling fingers. To Liam Hayes. From Office of the Chief Executive. Subject: Q3 Data Review, Mandatory Follow-up. Mr. Hayes, Mr. Vance requires a detailed, one-on-one review regarding the localized beta testing algorithms you cited in this morning's board meeting. You are instructed to bring all relevant physical files to his private office on the 45th floor at exactly 6 p.m. today. Do not be late. I stared at the screen, the breath completely leaving my lungs. 6 o'clock. An hour after the rest of the marketing department clocked out and went home. The 45th floor would be completely deserted. The Ice King wasn't ignoring me. He was summoning me into the Lion's Den. End of Part 5. Part 6, The Lion's Den. The hours between 11 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening stretched into a grueling, psychological marathon. As the afternoon dragged on, the marketing department slowly emptied out. By 5:30, the frantic hum of ringing phones and clacking keyboards had faded into the eerie, hollow silence of an abandoned corporate floor. Sarah had waved a cheerful goodbye, completely oblivious to the fact that my heart was currently attempting to beat its way out of my ribcage. At exactly 5:58, I stood alone in the center of my cubicle. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm the violent trembling in my hands as I gathered a stack of physical files I knew Julian didn't actually need. The beta testing algorithms were entirely digital. Printing them was just a prop, a physical excuse to justify my presence on the 45th floor after hours. I smoothed down the front of my navy blue suit, checked my tie in the dark reflection of my dead computer monitor, and walked toward the elevator bank. I didn't take the executive elevator. The very thought of stepping back into that mahogany-paneled box sent a fresh wave of adrenaline and phantom heat rushing through my veins. Instead, I took the standard employee lift, watching the digital numbers slowly climb higher and higher. 40, 41, 42. With every passing floor, the air seemed to grow thinner. What if I had misread the email? What if this was an actual disciplinary meeting? What if Julian had summoned me up here to coldly, professionally explain that Friday night was a mistake and that I was being transferred to a branch office in another state? Ding. The stainless steel doors slid open, revealing the cavernous, immaculate expanse of the 45th floor. The executive level was a completely different world from the rest of the building. The floors were lined with plush, sound-absorbing charcoal carpets. The lighting was soft, warm, and deliberately expensive. The walls were adorned with curated modern art, and the silence was absolute. Victoria Vance's massive, circular reception desk was completely deserted. The senior executive assistant, Julian's formidable gatekeeper, had clearly clocked out for the day. Directly behind her desk were 2 towering, heavy oak doors. The Lion's Den. I swallowed hard, my mouth completely dry, and walked across the quiet carpet. My shoes made barely a whisper of sound. I stopped in front of the massive doors, clutching the manila folders to my chest like a physical shield. I raised a shaking fist and knocked twice. Enter. The single word vibrated through the heavy wood, smooth, deep, and laced with absolute authority. I turned the heavy brass handle and pushed the door open, stepping into the office. Julian's private sanctuary was breathtaking. It was a massive corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying, unobstructed view of the city skyline as twilight began to cast long, violet shadows across the glass. The office was decorated in stark, minimalist tones of slate, black leather, and polished chrome. It smelled distinctly of rich espresso and that intoxicating, sharp cedarwood cologne. Julian was seated behind a massive, slab-like obsidian desk. His suit jacket was off, draped meticulously over the back of his chair, but his tie was still perfectly knotted. He was reading a physical document, a gold fountain pen held lightly between his long fingers. He didn't look up when I walked in. He didn't say a word. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing us in. The silence was agonizing. "Mr. Vance," I started, my voice sounding painfully thin in the massive room. "I brought the beta testing files you requested regarding the Asian market projections." "Lock the door, Liam." The command cut through the quiet room like a gunshot. Julian still hadn't looked up from his paperwork, his tone entirely conversational, as if he were asking me to forward an email. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around, my fingers fumbling blindly for the heavy brass deadbolt on the inside of the door. With a solid metallic click, the lock engaged. When I turned back around, Julian was no longer looking at the document. He had dropped the gold pen onto the desk and was staring directly at me. The icy, impenetrable CEO I had seen in the boardroom was entirely gone. His gray eyes were dark, storm-filled, and blazing with a raw, territorial hunger that made my knees physically weak. Without breaking eye contact, Julian stood up from his leather chair. He walked around the edge of the massive obsidian desk, his movements slow, deliberate, and impossibly predatory. He stopped a few feet in front of me. The height difference between us suddenly felt incredibly pronounced. The air in the room crackled with an electric, unbearable tension. "The files," Julian murmured, his voice dropping to that low, gravelly register that made my spine shiver. His eyes flicked down to the manila folders clutched desperately to my chest. "Write the files," I babbled softly, my brain completely short-circuiting as his cedarwood scent enveloped me. "The algorithms are." I printed the graphs. Julian reached out, but he didn't take the files. Instead, his large hands clamped down on my wrists. With a swift, effortless motion, he pulled my arms apart, causing the manila folders to spill out of my grasp, scattering uselessly across the pristine charcoal carpet. Before I could even register the sound of the papers hitting the floor, Julian's hands moved from my wrists to my waist, gripping my hips with bruising, possessive force. He pulled me flush against his hard body, erasing the remaining distance between us. "You were magnificent today," Julian breathed, his voice raw with a fierce, unchecked pride. "In the boardroom, when you stood up to Eleanor. I have never wanted to drag someone across a conference table as badly as I wanted to drag you across it this morning." A violent shudder ripped through me. All the anxiety, all the terrifying doubts I had harbored over the weekend instantly vaporized under the sheer, scorching heat of his words. "You ignored me," I whispered, my hands instinctively reaching up to grip the broad, muscular expanse of his shoulders, needing to anchor myself before I collapsed entirely. "You looked right through me. I thought you had changed your mind." Julian's eyes closed for a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine pain crossing his sharp features. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his breath hot against my skin. "I am so sorry for that," he rasped, his lips brushing against my pulse point, sending a jolt of pure fire straight to my core. "It took every ounce of discipline I possess not to look at you, Liam. But Eleanor is a viper. She has been trying to oust me from the CEO position for 3 years. If she saw even a flicker of what I feel for you in my eyes, she would have had you fired by noon. So you acted like I didn't exist to protect me," I murmured, my fingers tangling into the dark hair at the nape of his neck, completely ruining its perfect styling. "I acted like the Ice King," Julian corrected, lifting his head to meet my gaze, his gray eyes blazing with intensity. "But I told you in the elevator, I am not putting the walls back up with you. Never with you." And then he kissed me. It wasn't frantic or desperate like the kiss in the dark elevator. This was a kiss of pure, absolute possession. It was deep, deliberate, and incredibly thorough. Julian's mouth moved against mine with a devastating level of skill, completely stripping away my breath, my logic, and my ability to stand. I gasped into his mouth as his tongue parted my lips, tasting of dark espresso and danger. My hands tightened in his hair, pulling him closer, desperate to absorb as much of him as humanly possible. His hands slid up my back, broad and warm, pressing me flush against his chest until I could feel the frantic, heavy rhythm of his heartbeat echoing my own. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathless. The quiet of the executive office was replaced by the ragged sound of our breathing. Julian rested his forehead against mine, his thumbs tracing the line of my jaw with a tenderness that completely contradicted the ruthless CEO persona he wore for the rest of the world. "I couldn't sleep a single hour this weekend," Julian confessed, his voice a husky whisper in the quiet room. "Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was you in that elevator." "I thought I was the only one," I admitted, a shaky, relieved laugh escaping my lips. Julian pulled back slightly, his expression suddenly sobering, shifting back into that sharp, calculating focus that made him a billionaire. He kept one hand firmly wrapped around my waist, keeping me anchored against him, as he turned slightly toward the massive window overlooking the city. "We have a problem, Liam," Julian said softly, the weight of his corporate empire suddenly returning to the room. My stomach gave a nervous lurch. "Eleanor." "Yes, but not just her," Julian replied, his eyes scanning the city lights below. "The board of directors enforces a strict non-fraternization policy. If we are caught, the consequences for you will be catastrophic. I will not allow your career to be collateral damage for my lack of self-control." "Julian, I told you, I don't care about the rules." "But I do," Julian interrupted firmly, looking back down at me. "Because I care about you. Which is why I spent the entire weekend restructuring the executive hierarchy of Vance Global Tech." I stared at him, my brain struggling to process the magnitude of his words. "You did what?" "Your current position leaves you entirely vulnerable," Julian explained, stepping back just enough to lean against the edge of his obsidian desk. He pulled me with him, standing me directly between his spread legs. "As a junior coordinator in marketing, Anderson can fire you, HR can fire you, the board can fire you. You are exposed." He reached out, his long fingers gently adjusting the knot of my silver tie, the gesture so intimately domestic it made my heart ache. "So, effective tomorrow morning," Julian continued, his voice dropping into a smooth, commanding cadence, "you are no longer a junior coordinator in the marketing department." My eyes widened in panic. "Are you firing me?" A slow, devastating smirk touched the corner of Julian's lips. It was a dangerous, thrilling expression that completely transformed his face. "I am promoting you," Julian said softly. "I have created a new position, executive liaison to the CEO. You will report directly and exclusively to me. Your desk will be moved to the 45th floor, right outside these doors. Your salary will be tripled. And most importantly, under the new corporate bylaws I drafted on Saturday, only the CEO has the authority to terminate your employment." I was completely paralyzed. He hadn't just found a loophole. He had rewritten the entire rulebook to put an impenetrable shield around me. He was moving me into the lion's den, right beside him, where no one else could touch me. "Julian," I breathed, entirely overwhelmed. "The board. Eleanor, they're going to scream favoritism. They're going to know exactly why you did this." "Let them scream," Julian whispered, his hands gripping my hips, pulling me firmly against the juncture of his thighs. His eyes darkened with that terrifying, brilliant ruthlessness that had built his empire. "They can suspect whatever they want, Liam. But as long as you are my executive liaison, they cannot lay a single finger on you. You belong to me now, professionally and otherwise." The sheer possessiveness in his voice sent a violent, electrifying shiver straight down my spine. The danger was astronomical. We were playing a high-stakes game against some of the most ruthless corporate predators in the city. But as Julian leaned in, his lips brushing dangerously close to mine, I knew I was already all in. End of Part 6. Part 7, The Glass Wall. Stepping off the elevator onto the 45th floor on Tuesday morning felt like stepping onto a completely different planet. Gone was the chaotic, fluorescent-lit hum of the marketing department. Up here, the air was heavily filtered, cool, and carried the faint scent of lemon polish and wealth. The thick charcoal carpet swallowed the sound of my footsteps entirely, making the cavernous executive suite feel like a pristine, silent cathedral. My heart hammered a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs as I approached the massive circular reception desk. Victoria Vance, Julian's senior executive assistant, and as office rumor had it, his second cousin, was already seated behind her array of monitors. She was a striking woman in her late 40s, dressed in a severely tailored ivory suit, with silver hair pulled back into a flawless chignon. She had a reputation for being entirely ruthless, the ultimate gatekeeper to the Ice King. As I approached, her sharp, intelligent blue eyes locked onto me. She didn't smile. "Mr. Hayes," Victoria said, her voice smooth but laced with a distinctly assessing edge. "You are exactly 4 minutes early. Punctuality is a trait Julian values highly. Let us hope you possess others to justify this unprecedented restructuring." I swallowed hard, clutching my leather briefcase. "Good morning, Ms. Vance. I assure you, I am ready to work." "We shall see," she replied dryly. She stood up, gesturing gracefully toward a brand-new, sleek mahogany desk positioned just outside the heavy oak doors of Julian's office. "Your workstation. You have full administrative access to the executive server, a direct encrypted line to the CEO, and clearance to all board-level financial projections. Julian has also instructed me to forward all of his interdepartmental communications through you." My eyes widened as I set my briefcase down. "All of them?" "Yes," Victoria stated, her gaze narrowing slightly as she studied my face. "Julian has never allowed anyone to filter his communications before. He is notoriously territorial about his data. Whatever you did in that boardroom yesterday, Mr. Hayes, you have managed to earn a level of trust from that man that I have not seen in the 5 years I have worked for him. Do not make him regret it." "I won't," I promised, the weight of Julian's protection settling heavily on my shoulders. Victoria gave a curt nod and returned to her desk. I sat down in my new, ridiculously ergonomic leather chair and booted up my computer. The physical layout of my new workspace was agonizingly deliberate. My desk was positioned adjacent to Julian's office. While the heavy oak doors were currently closed, the wall separating us was made entirely of soundproof, frosted architectural glass. However, there was a clear, unfrosted horizontal band right at eye level. At exactly 8 o'clock, the oak doors swung open, and Julian walked out. He looked devastating. He was wearing a 3-piece midnight blue suit that hugged his broad shoulders and narrow waist with tailored perfection. His dark hair was meticulously styled, his jaw clenched in its usual, imposing line. He was the Ice King, fully armored for a day of corporate warfare. He stopped at Victoria's desk to collect a stack of morning briefs, his voice low and commanding. He didn't look in my direction. He didn't even cast a glance toward my desk. But as he turned to walk back into his office, he paused right behind the glass wall. Through the clear band of glass, his piercing gray eyes locked directly onto mine. For 3 excruciatingly long seconds, the rest of the world completely dissolved. The coldness in his expression vanished, replaced by a dark, simmering heat that sent a violent, heavy flush straight down my neck. It was a look of pure, unadulterated possession. Then he turned away, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind him. A moment later, a small notification pinged on my computer screen. It was a message on the secure, encrypted executive server. "J. Vance, navy blue suits you, Liam. But it is taking every ounce of my willpower not to walk out there and lock you in here with me." I choked on a breath, my face burning as I quickly typed a reply, entirely terrified that Victoria could somehow see my screen, even though I knew the line was encrypted. "L. Hayes, you're the one who put my desk right outside your window. You have a meeting with the legal team in 10 minutes. Please focus. J. Vance, I am the CEO. I can cancel the legal team. I can cancel the entire day. L. Hayes, don't you dare. J. Vance, then do not bite your lip while you are reading your emails. It is incredibly distracting." My teeth instantly released my bottom lip. My pulse was racing, a giddy, terrifying thrill coursing through my veins. The juxtaposition between the terrifying, untouchable billionaire sitting in that office and the man flirting with me over a secure server was completely intoxicating. We were playing a dangerous, high-stakes game of hide-and-seek in plain sight. The morning passed in a blur of intense work. Julian had me cross-referencing massive data sets, preparing for the upcoming quarterly shareholder meeting. It was challenging, high-level work that pushed me to my limits, but I loved it. At precisely 1 o'clock, the quiet atmosphere of the 45th floor was violently shattered. The elevator doors chimed, and Eleanor stepped out. The board member looked like a predatory bird in a crimson designer suit. Her sharp heels clicked aggressively against the hardwood borders of the carpet as she bypassed Victoria's desk entirely, marching straight toward my workstation. "Ms. Vance, I need a word with Julian immediately," Eleanor demanded, not even looking at the assistant. "Mr. Vance is currently on a classified conference call with our European investors, Eleanor," Victoria said smoothly, rising from her chair. "He is not to be disturbed. I am a senior board member. I do not need an appointment," Eleanor snapped. She stopped right in front of my desk, her cold, calculating eyes raking over me with undisguised disdain. "And it seems Julian has enough free time to invent fictitious positions for junior coordinators. I must say, Mr. Hayes, I was quite surprised to see the corporate restructuring memo this morning." I stood up, keeping my posture rigid and my expression neutral, channeling every ounce of Julian's composure. "Good afternoon, Ms. Eleanor. The restructuring was implemented to streamline interdepartmental communications. How can I help you?" Eleanor leaned forward, placing both of her manicured hands flat on my mahogany desk. Her perfume was suffocatingly floral. "You can drop the act, boy," Eleanor hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for me. "I don't know what kind of game you are playing, but I have been on this board for 15 years. Julian Vance does not have a heart. He is a machine. If you think batting your eyelashes and saving a presentation has secured you a permanent place on this floor, you are horribly mistaken. The moment you make a mistake, and you will make a mistake, I will personally see to it that the board tears you apart." My blood ran cold. The threat wasn't veiled. It was a direct declaration of war. Before I could formulate a professional response, the heavy oak doors behind me swung open with such force they nearly hit the wall. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. Julian stepped out of his office. He wasn't just the Ice King now. He was a god of absolute, terrifying wrath. His gray eyes were practically black, locked onto Eleanor with a level of fury that made the air in the room feel physically heavy. "Eleanor," Julian said softly. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than if he had shouted. "Step away from my liaison's desk." Eleanor straightened up, though I noticed a slight tremor in her hands. "Julian, I was just welcoming Mr. Hayes to the executive floor. The board has some serious concerns regarding this sudden promotion." "The board does not run my private staff," Julian cut her off, his voice slicing through her words like a scalpel. He took a slow, menacing step forward, placing himself deliberately between Eleanor and my desk. His broad back completely shielded me from her view. "Mr. Hayes answers exclusively to me. His promotion was authorized under Section 4 of the Executive Bylaws, which I drafted. If you have a problem with it, you can file a formal grievance with legal. But if you ever approach his desk again without an appointment, I will personally revoke your access to this floor. Do I make myself absolutely clear?" The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stood perfectly still at her desk, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Eleanor's face flushed a mottled, ugly red. She opened her mouth to argue, but Julian took one more step forward, his towering frame completely dominating her. The sheer, predatory aura radiating from him forced her to take a step back. "Crystal clear, Julian," Eleanor spat bitterly. She turned on her heel and marched back to the elevator, hammering the button. The moment the stainless steel doors closed behind her, Julian turned around. His chest was heaving slightly beneath his tailored suit, his eyes wild and stormy. "Victoria," Julian commanded, his voice tight. "Take an early lunch." "An hour." "Yes, Mr. Vance," Victoria replied instantly, grabbing her purse and practically fleeing toward the elevators. The second the floor was completely empty, Julian's hand shot out. He grabbed my wrist, his grip iron tight but incredibly careful not to hurt me, and practically dragged me into his massive corner office. He slammed the heavy oak doors shut and locked the deadbolt in one fluid motion. Before I could even take a breath, Julian spun me around, pressing me back against the heavy wood of the door. His hands immediately went to my face, his thumbs frantically tracing my cheekbones, my jaw, my lips, as if checking to make sure I was still intact. "Did she threaten you?" Julian demanded, his voice a low, ragged growl. The polished CEO was entirely gone, replaced by a man who looked like he was ready to commit murder. "Tell me exactly what she said to you, Liam." "Julian, I'm fine," I breathed, my heart hammering a wild rhythm against my chest. The sheer intensity of his protectiveness was entirely overwhelming. "She just said she was waiting for me to make a mistake. It was just intimidation." "I am going to destroy her," Julian whispered fiercely, his forehead dropping to rest against mine. His breath was hot and uneven. I am going to systematically dismantle her entire portfolio and force her off the board. No one speaks to you like that. No one. Julian, stop, I said softly, bringing my hands up to grip his lapels. I could feel the violent tension coiled in his muscles. You don't have to ruin the company for me. I can handle Eleanor. I'm not afraid of her. Julian pulled back slightly, his dark, stormy eyes searching my face. You should be. This world is vicious, Liam. And you are everything to me. The confession hung in the quiet, air-conditioned space of the office, heavy and absolute. It wasn't just a physical attraction anymore. It wasn't just a byproduct of being trapped in an elevator. This powerful, terrifying man was completely, entirely devoted to me. Then show me, I challenged softly, my voice trembling as a wave of pure, reckless heat flooded my veins. Julian didn't need to be told twice. With a desperate groan, he crushed his mouth to mine. The kiss was explosive, fueled by the adrenaline of the confrontation and the agonizing hours we had spent staring at each other through the glass. His hands slid down to my waist, gripping me fiercely as he backed me away from the door, walking me blindly across the plush carpet until the back of my knees hit the edge of his massive obsidian desk. He lifted me effortlessly, sitting me on the edge of the desk, stepping entirely into my space until my legs bracketed his hips. His mouth never left mine. It was a chaotic, possessive assault on my senses. I tangled my fingers into his perfectly styled hair, ruining it entirely, pulling him closer as he kissed me with a hunger that felt like it could consume me alive. Mine, Julian growled against my lips, his hands sliding under my suit jacket, his warm palms branding the skin of my back through my thin cotton shirt. You belong to me, Liam. Do you understand? Yes, I gasped, entirely lost in the intoxicating scent of cedarwood and the overwhelming power of his touch. We were playing a terrifying game, suspended in a glass tower, surrounded by wolves. But as Julian's lips trailed burning kisses down my jawline, making my head fall back with a quiet, breathy sigh, I knew I would gladly burn the entire company to the ground if it meant I could stay right here in the lion's den. End of Part 7. Part 8. The Price of the Pedestal. Julian, I gasped, my voice fracturing as his lips trailed a burning path down the sensitive skin of my neck. Julian, wait. Victoria. She's going to be back. The reality of our location pierced through the intoxicating haze of adrenaline and desire. We were in the center of the executive suite, separated from the rest of the company by nothing but a heavy oak door and a lock that anyone with a master keycard could bypass. Julian froze. He let out a ragged, heavy sigh, resting his forehead against my shoulder. I could feel the violent, rapid thrumming of his heart against my chest, a physical testament to the sheer restraint it took for him to pull away. I despise that clock, he muttered darkly, his breath hot against my collarbone. He slowly stepped back, his hands lingering on my waist for an extra, agonizing second before entirely letting go. The sudden absence of his body heat left me shivering. I hopped down from the edge of the obsidian desk, my legs feeling like they were made of absolute jelly. My suit jacket was wrinkled, my tie was slightly askew, and my face was undoubtedly flushed a deep, telltale crimson. Julian, on the other hand, possessed an infuriating superpower. With 2 swift adjustments to his cuffs and a single smoothing motion over his vest, he looked completely untouched. The Ice King was back, flawless and imposing. The only betrayal of what had just happened was the lingering, dark intensity in his gray eyes. "Fix your hair, Liam," Julian murmured, walking back around his desk and picking up his gold fountain pen. "It looks exactly like my hands have been in it." I shot him a heated glare, frantically trying to smooth down my messy brown hair in the reflection of the glass wall. "You are impossible." "I am the CEO," he corrected smoothly, though a faint, devastating smirk played at the corner of his lips. "Unlock the door." I turned the heavy brass deadbolt just as the soft ding of the executive elevator echoed from the lobby. Victoria was back. I slipped out of the oak doors and sat down at my desk, burying my face in a quarterly projection spreadsheet just as she walked around the corner. She cast a sharp, assessing look at my flushed face, but miraculously, she didn't say a word. 3 weeks passed. Working as the executive liaison to Julian Vance was the most exhilarating and exhausting experience of my life. Professionally, I was thriving. The workload was astronomical, but Julian was a brilliant mentor. He didn't just give me busy work. He trusted me with high-level data analysis, board-level communications, and strategic planning. We operated like a perfectly synchronized machine. But it was the private moments that made the grueling hours entirely worth it. We existed in a secret, high-stakes bubble. The glass walls separating our desks became an instrument of delicious torture. Julian would sit in his office, projecting the image of the untouchable, ruthless billionaire to anyone who walked in. But the moment the room was empty, he would look through that clear band of glass with a gaze so fiercely possessive it made my breath catch. We stole moments in the encrypted server chat, lingering touches when passing documents, and breathless, desperate kisses in the private executive elevator when we were absolutely certain the cameras were on a loop. I was happy. Terrifyingly, overwhelmingly happy. But outside of the 45th floor, the corporate machine was beginning to bare its teeth. The transition had been too sudden, too unprecedented. Going from a junior marketing coordinator to the CEO's right-hand man overnight was the corporate equivalent of catching lightning in a bottle. And in a building filled with thousands of ambitious, ruthless employees, lightning always drew a crowd. The whispers started small. A lingering stare in the cafeteria. A sudden hush when I stepped into a crowded elevator. But by the end of the third week, the rumors had mutated into a vicious, suffocating toxicity. It came to a head on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Julian had asked me to retrieve a specific, archived physical portfolio from the marketing department, my old floor. I took the standard elevator down, navigating the maze of cubicles with a familiar ease. As I approached the break room to grab a cup of coffee before heading back up, I heard voices drifting through the open doorway. Familiar voices. "I'm just saying, it's completely ridiculous," Sarah's voice echoed, sharp and bitter. He was struggling to put together a basic Q2 PowerPoint a month ago, and now he's making six figures and gatekeeping the CEO? Please. He played his cards right. I'll give him that, Dave replied, the sound of a coffee stirrer clinking against ceramic. I mean, look at him. He's cute. And the Ice King is single and notoriously isolated. Liam just found a crack in the armor and slept his way right through it. It's disgusting. Another voice, a senior analyst named Mark, chimed in. He's a climber, a gold digger. He batted his eyes, spread his legs, and bypassed a decade of hard work. Anderson said Eleanor is furious about it. The board knows exactly what's going on up there. Liam won't last 6 months. When Vance gets bored of his new toy, he'll throw him out, and his career will be totally radioactive. I froze in the hallway, the physical portfolio slipping slightly in my sweaty grip. The words felt like physical blows to the stomach. Climber, gold digger, toy. They didn't see the hours I put in. They didn't see the complex algorithms I had mastered, or the fact that Julian genuinely valued my intellect. To them, I was just a cheap stereotype, a scandalous punchline to a corporate joke. A heavy, suffocating weight settled over my chest. I turned around, entirely abandoning the coffee, and walked numbly back to the elevator. By the time I reached the 45th floor, my hands were trembling. I kept my head down, avoiding Victoria's sharp gaze, and practically hid behind my computer monitors. I spent the next 3 hours staring blankly at spreadsheets, the vicious words echoing relentlessly in my mind. I tried to hide it. I really did. I didn't want Julian to know that the rumors were getting to me. He had already risked so much to put me in this position. The last thing I wanted to be was a burden or a liability. But Julian Vance noticed everything. At 7 o'clock, the floor was completely deserted. The sun had set, casting the executive suite in deep, shadowy hues. I was aggressively typing an email, trying to force my brain to focus, when my desk phone buzzed. "Come into my office, Liam." His voice was clipped and professional. I grabbed a notepad, pasting on a blank, neutral expression, and walked through the heavy oak doors. Julian was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering city skyline. He had discarded his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, his powerful forearms braced against the glass. "You needed me, Mr. Vance?" I asked politely, keeping my distance. Julian didn't turn around. "You have been staring at the same cell on that spreadsheet for exactly 42 minutes. You haven't sent a single message on the encrypted server all afternoon. And when I walked past your desk an hour ago, you actively flinched." My stomach dropped. "I'm just tired. It's been a long week." Julian finally turned, his gray eyes piercing through the dim lighting of the office, completely shredding my pathetic lie to pieces. He walked slowly across the room, closing the distance between us until he was standing just inches away. "Do not lie to me, Liam," Julian said softly, his voice laced with a dangerous, protective edge. I can handle the board. I can handle the pressure. But I will not tolerate you shutting me out. What happened today? Nothing, I insisted, looking down at my shoes, entirely unable to meet his intense gaze. It's fine. I'm fine. Julian let out a frustrated breath. His hands reached out, gently but firmly gripping my shoulders, forcing me to look up at him. I am the CEO of this company, Julian stated, his voice a low rumble. There is not a single whisper, rumor, or conversation that happens in this building that does not eventually reach my desk. I know what they are saying about you. My breath hitched, a hot, humiliating tear pricking the corner of my eye. I blinked it away furiously, hating how weak I felt. They think I'm a joke, Julian, I whispered, the painful admission finally breaking free. They think I'm a gold digger who seduced you for a title. They think I'm just your toy. And the worst part is, I can't even defend myself, because if I tell them the truth, if I tell them that I genuinely care about you, it just confirms that we're breaking the rules. Julian's jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. A terrifying, violent fury darkened his features. The Ice King was gone, replaced entirely by a man fiercely, violently protective of what was his. Give me names, Julian demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. Tell me exactly who you heard speaking about you today, and their desks will be cleared out by security before midnight. No, I panicked, grabbing his wrists. Julian, you can't do that. If you start firing people for gossiping about me, it's just going to prove Eleanor right. It's going to cause a massive scandal. You promised me you wouldn't let this ruin the company. I do not care about the company if it costs me you. Julian roared, the sudden volume of his voice echoing off the glass walls. He pulled me flush against his chest, wrapping his arms around me in a crushing, desperate embrace. He buried his face in my hair, his chest heaving. The sheer, raw emotion pouring off him was staggering. I promised to protect you, Julian murmured fiercely against my temple. I brought you up to this floor to keep you safe, and instead, I have placed you in a crossfire. I will not let them break you, Liam. I won't allow it. I wrapped my arms around his waist, holding on to him like a lifeline, absorbing his strength. They won't break me. I just need a minute to breathe. It's so suffocating in this building. Julian pulled back slightly, his hands cupping my face. He studied my exhausted, stressed expression for a long, heavy moment. The furious storm in his eyes slowly shifted, settling into a deep, calculated resolve. Then we will leave it, Julian said decisively. I blinked, confused. Leave the building? You mean go home for the night? I mean leave the city, Julian corrected, his thumbs gently wiping away the stray tear that had finally escaped my eye. He stepped back, walking toward his desk and picking up his personal cell phone. The environment here is currently toxic, and you are exhausted. We need distance to recalibrate. Julian, we can't just leave, I argued, my practical side warring with the sheer, desperate desire to escape. We have the Q4 board review on Monday. We have a mountain of paperwork. The board can wait. The paperwork can burn, Julian stated effortlessly, dialing a number on his phone. He looked at me, a soft, incredibly tender smile breaking through his imposing facade. Pack a bag tonight, Liam. Warm clothes. Where are we going? I asked, my heart beginning to race with a completely different kind of adrenaline. A business trip, Julian said smoothly, though the wicked gleam in his eye suggested anything but business. My family owns a private cabin in Aspen. It is completely isolated, heavily secured, and currently sitting empty. We are going to take the private jet, and for the next 4 days, Vance Global Tech ceases to exist. Before I could protest, the person on the other end of the line answered. Prepare the jet for a late-night departure, Julian commanded into the phone, his gaze never leaving mine. Mr. Hayes and I are going to Aspen. He hung up, tossing the phone onto the obsidian desk. He walked slowly back to me, the suffocating weight of the corporate world seeming to completely evaporate from his shoulders. 4 days, Julian whispered, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me into a soft, dizzying kiss. No board members. No whispers. No rules. Just us. As I kissed him back, the heavy, painful knot in my chest finally unraveled. We were running away, and for the first time since I stepped onto the executive floor, I felt entirely perfectly safe. End of Part 8. Part 9, The Snow Globe. The transition from the suffocating, hyper-competitive atmosphere of Vance Global Tech to the surreal luxury of Julian's private life was enough to give me whiplash. I had barely managed to throw a few sweaters and jeans into a duffel bag before a sleek black town car was idling outside my apartment building. Less than an hour later, I was stepping onto the tarmac of a private airfield, the freezing night air whipping at my coat as I stared up at the massive, gleaming Gulfstream jet. The interior of the aircraft was nicer than any apartment I had ever lived in. There were plush cream-colored leather seats, polished walnut tables, and soft, ambient lighting that made the cabin feel incredibly intimate. But the most striking difference wasn't the billionaire luxury. It was the man sitting across from me. Julian had entirely shed the armor of the Ice King. Gone was the bespoke three-piece suit and the perfectly knotted silk tie. Instead, he was wearing a thick, dark charcoal cashmere sweater that clung to the broad lines of his chest and shoulders, paired with dark tailored trousers. His hair, usually slicked back into an imposing, flawless style, was slightly tousled, falling softly across his forehead. He looked younger, wildly handsome, and completely relaxed. For the first hour of the flight, neither of us said much. The exhaustion of the week had finally caught up to me, and I sank into the leather seat, completely mesmerized by the dark, endless expanse of the night sky outside the window. When I finally turned my head, I found Julian watching me. He wasn't looking at a tablet, or reviewing a spreadsheet, or answering emails on his phone. His entire, undivided attention was focused squarely on me, his gray eyes soft and filled with a quiet, profound warmth that made my heart flutter wildly against my ribs. "You look like you're a million miles away," Julian murmured, his deep voice easily cutting through the quiet hum of the jet engines. "Just trying to process everything," I admitted, offering a small, tired smile. "If you had told me a month ago that I would be flying to Aspen on a private jet with the CEO of my company, I would have told you that you were completely insane." A low, vibrating chuckle escaped Julian's lips. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and closed the distance between us, sliding into the wide leather seat right beside mine. The sudden proximity sent a familiar, electric jolt through my veins. He reached out, his warm, large hand entirely engulfing mine, his thumb slowly tracing the line of my knuckles. "If someone had told me a month ago that I would be willing to abandon my company on a Thursday night just to see you smile," Julian replied softly, his eyes locking onto mine, "I would have said the exact same thing. But here we are." I leaned my head against his shoulder, breathing in the intoxicating, familiar scent of cedarwood mixed with the faint, expensive aroma of the cashmere. Here we are. By the time we landed at the private airstrip in Aspen, the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the mountainous landscape in pristine white. A heavily tinted, rugged SUV was waiting for us on the tarmac. The drive up the mountain was winding and completely desolate. The higher we climbed, the more the rest of the world seemed to entirely fade away, buried beneath the snow and the towering pine trees. When the SUV finally pulled to a stop, my breath caught in my throat. Julian had called it a cabin, but that was the understatement of the century. It was a massive architectural masterpiece constructed of dark, heavy timber and soaring floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered an unobstructed, panoramic view of the snow-covered valley below. It looked like a luxury fortress entirely secluded from the rest of humanity. The driver carried our bags inside and immediately departed, leaving the two of us completely alone in the massive house. I stood in the center of the sprawling living room, entirely awestruck. The space was anchored by a colossal, floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace. The furniture was massive, plush, and incredibly inviting, draped in thick fur throws. The silence here was different from the silence on the 45th floor. That silence was tense, loaded with corporate danger. This silence was pure, absolute peace. "It's breathtaking, Julian," I whispered, turning around in a slow circle. Julian was standing by the door, watching me with that same, intense, predatory focus. He slowly took off his heavy winter coat, tossing it over a chair, before walking toward me. His footsteps made no sound on the thick rugs. "It has always just been a piece of real estate to me," Julian said, stopping right in front of me. His hands came up to grip the lapels of my coat, slowly unbuttoning it. "A place to hide when the board became too suffocating. But looking at you standing in it, I think this is the first time it has ever felt like a home." He slid the heavy coat off my shoulders, tossing it aside, and pulled me flush against his chest. The kiss he pressed to my lips wasn't frantic or desperate. It was slow, agonizingly tender, and laced with a deep, reverent devotion. It was the kind of kiss that made my knees completely weak, the kind that promised absolute safety. I tangled my fingers in his soft cashmere sweater, opening my mouth to him, entirely melting into his warmth as the snow continued to violently swirl outside the glass walls. "I'm going to light the fire," Julian murmured against my lips, completely reluctant to pull away. "There is a bottle of aged bourbon in the study. Why don't you pour us a drink?" I nodded breathlessly, my lips tingling, and made my way toward the study. By the time I returned with 2 heavy crystal glasses of amber liquid, Julian had a massive, roaring fire crackling in the stone hearth. The golden light flickered across the room, casting long, dancing shadows and illuminating the sharp, handsome planes of Julian's face as he sat on the plush rug in front of the flames. I handed him a glass and sat down beside him, drawing my knees up to my chest. For a long time, we just sat there, listening to the pop and hiss of the burning wood. The heat radiating from the hearth was incredible, entirely seeping into my bones and melting away the last lingering remnants of the corporate anxiety that had been plaguing me all week. Julian took a slow sip of his bourbon, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I have been thinking about what Eleanor said to you," Julian began, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. The mention of the board member's name made my stomach tighten slightly, but Julian reached out, placing his warm hand firmly on my knee to ground me. "About you being a secret. About this being a game. Julian, you don't have to explain." "I do," Julian interrupted gently but firmly. He set his glass down on the stone hearth and turned to face me completely. "I have spent my entire life building walls. I was raised in a world where any vulnerability, any emotional attachment, was immediately weaponized and used against you. When I took over the company, I became the Ice King because it was the only way to survive the sheer, ruthless greed of the board. I watched him, my heart aching at the raw, unguarded honesty in his eyes. He was peeling back the final layers of his armor, completely exposing the man beneath the billionaire facade. And then I saw you," Julian continued, his thumb slowly tracing the line of my jaw. "You were standing in the marketing department, completely overwhelmed by a spreadsheet, biting the end of your pen. And in that single second, every wall I had ever built completely cracked. I spent a year trying to convince myself that I could ignore it, that I could protect you by keeping my distance. But the truth is, Liam, I was just terrified." "Terrified of what?" I whispered, leaning into his touch. "Terrified that if I let you in, and I lost you, there would be absolutely nothing left of me," Julian confessed, his voice dropping to a gravelly, vulnerable whisper. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't playing a game. He wasn't keeping me hidden because he was ashamed of me. He was keeping me hidden because he valued me more than his own empire, and he was terrified the wolves would tear me apart. I set my glass down, shifting my body so I was straddling his lap. I bracketed his hips with my knees, wrapping my arms securely around his neck. Julian's hands instantly found my waist, pulling me impossibly closer until our chests were completely flushed together. "You aren't going to lose me, Julian," I said fiercely, staring directly into his storm-gray eyes. "I am not fragile. I don't care about the whispers or the rumors or Eleanor's threats. I only care about this. About you." Julian let out a ragged, trembling breath, his eyes darkening with a surge of raw, overwhelming emotion. "I am going to give you everything, Liam," he vowed, his hands sliding up my back, pulling me down until our lips collided. The kiss ignited into a blazing, entirely consuming fire. There was no hesitation, no holding back, no fear of the office door opening. We were entirely alone at the top of the world, suspended in a snow globe where the only reality was the heat of his skin and the desperate, frantic rhythm of our hearts. Julian lowered me backward onto the thick, soft fur rug, his large frame hovering over me, shielding me entirely. His kisses trailed down my jaw, completely setting my skin on fire, his hands mapping every inch of my body with a possessive, worshipful intensity that made me gasp his name into the quiet room. For the next 3 days, Vance Global Tech truly ceased to exist. We didn't look at our phones. We didn't open a single laptop. We spent our days wrapped in thick blankets, watching the snow fall, and our nights entirely consumed by each other in front of the roaring fire. Julian was affectionate, attentive, and incredibly protective. I fell completely, irrevocably in love with the man beneath the ice. But reality has a terrifying way of breaking through the strongest of glass walls. On Sunday night, as we were packing our bags to return to the city, the absolute peace of the cabin was violently shattered by the sharp, shrill ring of Julian's encrypted corporate cell phone. Julian, who was folding a sweater, froze. He stared at the device on the table as if it were a venomous snake. He slowly walked over and picked it up, reading the flashing message on the screen. Instantly, the warmth vanished from his eyes. His jaw clenched, the muscles ticking violently, and the terrifying, imposing aura of the CEO slammed entirely back into place. "What is it?" I asked, a cold spike of dread piercing my chest. Julian looked up at me, his gray eyes colder and more dangerous than I had ever seen them. "It's Eleanor," Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "She has convened an emergency session of the board of directors for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. My stomach dropped into my shoes. "Why?" "Because," Julian replied, his grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles turned white. "She has formally motioned for a vote of no confidence to strip me of my title as CEO, citing a gross violation of corporate ethics regarding my relationship with my executive liaison." The wolves hadn't just circled. They had finally broken down the door. End of Part 9. Part 10, The Checkmate. The flight back to the city was a masterclass in suffocating tension. The serene, snow-covered bubble we had lived in for the past 3 days had violently burst, replaced by the deafening roar of the jet engines and the heavy, crushing weight of reality. Julian sat across from me in the plush leather seat, his laptop open on the mahogany table, his phone pressed to his ear. For 2 straight hours, he spoke in rapid, clipped tones to his legal team, his voice a lethal, low frequency that vibrated with absolute warfare. The Ice King had returned, but this time, he wasn't just cold. He was apocalyptic. I sat quietly, staring out the window at the dark clouds below, my stomach tied in agonizing knots. Eleanor had played her hand perfectly. By calling an emergency board meeting on a Monday morning, she had ensured maximum corporate theater. She wanted a public execution. She wanted to humiliate Julian, strip him of his life's work, and completely obliterate my future in the process. When the Gulfstream finally touched down, Julian closed his laptop with a sharp snap. He walked over, sliding into the seat beside me, and took my trembling hand in his large, warm grip. "Liam," Julian murmured, his gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that chased away the chill in my bones. "Tomorrow morning is going to be vicious. They are going to throw every accusation, every piece of fabricated evidence they have at us to try and break our resolve. But I need you to promise me one thing." "Anything," I breathed, my fingers tightening around his. "Do not let go of my hand," Julian commanded softly, pressing a firm, reassuring kiss to my knuckles. "No matter what she says, no matter what happens in that room, you stand beside me. We walk in together, and we walk out together. Do you understand? Together," I promised, a fierce, reckless courage suddenly blooming in my chest. If this was the end of our corporate lives, I was going down fighting beside the man I loved. Monday morning, 7:45 a.m. The atmosphere in the lobby of Vance Global Tech was absolutely electric. The news of the emergency board meeting had leaked, and the entire building was practically vibrating with morbid anticipation. As Julian and I walked through the revolving glass doors, the bustling lobby came to a complete, terrifying standstill. Every single eye turned to look at us. Normally, Julian would walk 5 paces ahead, ignoring the masses, a god among mortals. But today, he did the unthinkable. He slowed his pace, shifting his broad shoulders until he was walking exactly by my side. When a senior VP stared a little too long at me, Julian shot him a glare so violently cold the man physically took a step backward. It was the ultimate, undeniable power move. Julian Vance was announcing to the entire company that I wasn't just a subordinate, I was his equal. I was his. We rode the executive elevator to the 45th floor in complete silence. Victoria was waiting at her desk. She didn't offer a polite greeting. She simply handed Julian a thick, leather-bound dossier and gave me a sharp, respectful nod. At exactly 8 o'clock, Julian pushed open the heavy double doors of the executive boardroom. The room was packed. All 12 members of the board of directors were seated around the massive mahogany table. Eleanor sat at the opposite end of the room, looking like a venomous spider in a sharp black suit, a triumphant, vicious smirk playing on her lips. Julian didn't flinch. He walked to the head of the table, pulling out the chair to his right and gesturing for me to sit. A collective, outraged gasp rippled through the older board members. The executive liaison was not permitted to sit at the board table, let alone directly beside the CEO. I kept my chin high, my face a mask of neutral composure, and sat down. Julian took his seat beside me, placing the leather dossier flat on the polished wood. "Let us not waste time, Eleanor," Julian stated, his voice a booming, terrifying baritone that commanded the absolute submission of the room. "You have convened an emergency session. State your motion." Eleanor stood up, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. She pressed a button on a remote, and the massive screen behind her illuminated, displaying the flight logs of Julian's private jet, alongside the corporate restructuring documents that had created my position. "I motion for an immediate vote of no confidence to remove Julian Vance from the position of Chief Executive Officer," Eleanor declared, her voice ringing out clearly. "The evidence is undeniable. Mr. Vance has engaged in a gross violation of corporate ethics by promoting a wildly underqualified junior coordinator, Liam Hayes, to the highest administrative clearance in the company, simply to facilitate a deeply inappropriate personal affair." The room erupted into low, scandalized murmurs. Eleanor wasn't finished. She turned her venomous gaze directly to me. "He has compromised the security of Vance Global Tech, jeopardized shareholder assets, and turned this executive floor into his own private playground. He is unstable, reckless, and entirely unfit to lead." She sat down, crossing her arms with a smug, victorious sneer. "The floor is yours, Julian, though I doubt you have a defense." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and entirely dangerous. Julian didn't immediately respond. He sat perfectly still, his long fingers steepled in front of him. He slowly turned his head to look at me, a profound, completely unguarded softness flashing in his gray eyes, before he turned back to the board. When he finally spoke, the Ice King had returned with absolute, terrifying vengeance. "My defense, Eleanor, is that you are an absolute amateur," Julian said softly, the quietness of his voice chilling the room to absolute zero. He flipped open the leather dossier. "3 weeks ago, I promoted Liam Hayes to my direct liaison," Julian began, his voice lethal and precise. "You assumed I did this to protect a secret affair. You assumed I was blinded by my personal attachments. What you failed to realize is that Liam is a prodigy in data analysis. And the moment I gave him administrative access to the executive server, I tasked him with something very specific." My heart hammered in my chest. I knew exactly what was in that dossier. It was the grueling, complex cross-referencing I had been doing for the past 3 weeks. The numbers I thought were just standard Q4 projections. "I tasked him with auditing your personal offshore accounts, Eleanor," Julian revealed, sliding a heavily documented financial report down the length of the mahogany table. It stopped right in front of her. Eleanor's triumphant smirk completely vanished. Her face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. "For the past 4 years, you have been embezzling corporate funds through a series of shell companies disguised as Asian market logistics," Julian continued, his voice rising in power, dominating the room. "You have been bleeding this company dry. And when you realized Liam had flagged the logistical deficits in his marketing presentation last month, you panicked. You knew I would look closer. So, you tried to orchestrate a scandal to force me out before I could find the truth." The boardroom erupted into complete chaos. Board members were shouting, scrambling to look at the documents, their faces twisted in shock and outrage. "This is a lie," Eleanor shrieked, standing up, her hands trembling violently. "This is fabricated. You're trying to frame me to save your boy toy. The data is entirely indisputable." I spoke up, my voice steady, ringing out over the chaos. I looked her directly in the eye, channeling every ounce of Julian's icy composure. "The algorithms trace the diverted funds directly to a Cayman Islands account registered under your maiden name. The paper trail is absolute, Eleanor. You didn't cover your tracks well enough." Julian stood up, towering over the table. The sheer force of his presence forced the entire room back into terrified silence. "As the majority shareholder and founder of this company, I do not answer to a board of thieves," Julian growled, his eyes locking onto Eleanor like a predator about to strike. "You are terminated, effective immediately. Security is currently clearing out your office, and my legal team has already forwarded this dossier to the federal authorities. You will be facing federal prison by nightfall." Eleanor opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was completely, utterly destroyed. 2 massive security guards entered the boardroom, flanking her on either side, and silently escorted the ruined woman out the doors. Julian slowly swept his gaze over the remaining 11 board members. They were sweating, pale, and entirely terrified. "Does anyone else have concerns regarding my leadership?" Julian asked softly, the threat heavily implied. Or concerns regarding Mr. Hayes's qualifications for his position? No, sir, a senior board member stammered quickly. Your leadership is, as always, impeccable, Mr. Vance. Mr. Hayes's work is clearly exemplary. Excellent, Julian said smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket. This meeting is adjourned. Julian reached down, wrapping his large, warm hand securely around mine, lacing our fingers together in front of the entire board of directors. He pulled me to my feet, and together, without a single backward glance, we walked out of the boardroom. The moment the heavy double doors clicked shut behind us, the adrenaline crash hit me like a freight train. My knees buckled slightly, but Julian was there instantly, his strong arm wrapping around my waist, supporting my entire weight. Victoria stood at her desk. For the first time since I had met her, the severe, terrifying assistant had a genuine, brilliant smile on her face. A masterfully executed checkmate, Julian, Victoria praised softly. And Mr. Hayes, excellent data analysis. Thank you, Victoria. Hold all my calls for the rest of the day, Julian commanded, practically carrying me into his private office and kicking the heavy oak doors shut behind us. The deadbolt clicked into place, sealing us in our private sanctuary. Julian didn't hesitate. He backed me against the frosted glass wall, his hands framing my face, and kissed me with a desperate, overwhelming hunger. The kiss tasted of victory, of relief, and of a profound, entirely unshakable love. I tangled my hands in his dark hair, kissing him back with every ounce of passion I had in my body, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what we had just accomplished. We did it. I gasped against his lips, my chest heaving as he trailed burning kisses down my jaw. You completely destroyed her, Julian. No, Liam, Julian murmured, pulling back just enough to look deep into my eyes. His gray irises were soft, completely melted, shining with an adoration that made my heart physically ache. We destroyed her. I could never have done this without you. You are my anchor. You are my fire. He rested his forehead against mine, his thumbs gently stroking my cheekbones. The imposing CEO, the terrifying billionaire, the Ice King, they were all entirely gone, replaced by a man who was hopelessly, completely in love with me. There are no more secrets, Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. No more hiding in the shadows. No more rules holding us back. You belong by my side, Liam. Now and forever. I smiled, a bright, tearing smile of absolute joy, and pulled his lips back down to mine. We were no longer trapped in a dark elevator, terrified of the world outside. We were standing at the very top of the glass tower, bathed in the brilliant morning light, entirely untouchable. The ice had finally melted, and in its place was a beautiful, entirely unbreakable empire built just for us. The end. Wow. Just wow. Take a deep breath with me, everyone, because that was one intense ride. Hey guys, it's your BL boyfriend, and I just have to say a massive thank you for sticking with me until the very end of this story. If your heart is beating as fast as mine is right now, we are definitely on the same page. Let's just take a moment to unpack everything that just happened between Liam and Julian, because this story gave us everything we could ever want. We started off trapped in a dark, sweltering elevator, and honestly, the tension in those first few parts was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I mean, we all knew Julian Vance was the intimidating Ice King, right? But seeing that cold, untouchable billionaire completely lose his composure and melt just for Liam, that is the exact kind of romance we absolutely live for on this channel. What I really loved about this dynamic, and I'd love to know if you agree, is that Julian didn't just fall in love. He literally restructured his entire multi-million-dollar corporate empire just to keep Liam safe. That scene where he promoted Liam to his executive liaison and moved his desk to the 45th floor just so Eleanor couldn't touch him? Absolute boss move. It showed it wasn't just about physical attraction. It was about how fiercely protective he was of the person he loved. And Liam. Let's give some serious credit to our boy Liam. He didn't back down. When Eleanor tried to intimidate him at his desk, he held his ground. And in that final boardroom scene, he was the one who delivered the final blow with the offshore account data. They truly became the ultimate power couple, proving they were equals. But enough of my analysis. I want to hear from you. Let's have a little chat in the comments section. I have a few questions for you guys. First of all, what was your absolute favorite moment in the entire story? Was it the intense, messy first kiss in the dark elevator? Or maybe the cozy, romantic getaway in the Aspen snow globe where they finally had peace? Or were you living for that dramatic boardroom takedown at the end? Also, I have to ask, what would you honestly do if you were stuck in an elevator with your incredibly handsome but terrifying boss? Would you have the courage to call him out on his cold behavior like Liam did? Or would you be too nervous to speak? Let me know down below. I read every single one of your comments, and I love talking with you guys. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more thrilling, romantic, and intense BL content, please do me a huge favor and smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know what kind of stories you love. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload from your BL boyfriend. Thank you all so much for watching, for your amazing support, and for being the best community out there. Stay safe, keep loving BL, and I will see you in the next video with another amazing story. Bye for now.